the centuries roll backward. The salt air of the Mediterranean fills your lungs, and the empire breathes again. Behind me, the great promontory rises from the Gulf of Tunis, and upon it stands a city that once held the Western world in its grip. Whitewashed walls gleam under the North African sun. The twin harbours teem with merchant galleys and warships. The scent of murex dye drifts from workshops along the waterfront, that precious purple pigment worth more than gold. This is Carthage, and we have arrived at the very heart of a civilization that dared to challenge the mightiest power the ancient world would ever know. What you see today as scattered ruins across Byrsa Hill was once the most magnificent metropolis west of Alexandria, a city whose circular military harbour, the legendary Kothon, sheltered more than 200 warships in its docks. A city whose merchants traded silver from Iberia, tin from the Atlantic coast, grain from the fertile plains stretching behind us, and ivory carved by artisans whose skill rivaled any in the ancient world. Carthage was not merely a trading post, it was an empire, a culture, a way of life that endured for nearly 700 years, and we are going to tell its complete story. Every chapter, every turning point. From the moment Phoenician sailors from the great city of Tyre first chose this coastline around 814 years before Christ, guided by legend and the wisdom of Queen Dido, all the way to the flames that consumed these streets in 146 before Christ and beyond, into the echoes that still resonate in our world today. We will journey through 21 episodes spanning the full arc of Carthaginian civilization. We will witness Phoenician galleys navigating westward across open water, establishing the trading networks that made this city possible. We will walk through the sacred Tophet, where carved stelae still stand as silent witnesses to rituals dedicated to the goddess Tanit and the god Baal-Hamon. We will follow Hanno the Navigator as he sails beyond the Pillars of Heracles into the unknown waters of the Atlantic. We will study the genius of Mago, whose 28 volumes on agriculture were so respected that Rome itself ordered them translated after Carthage fell. And then we will march with Hannibal Barca. We will cross the Alps with elephants in the snow. We will stand on the field at Cannae, where Roman legions were shattered in the worst military defeat Rome ever suffered. And we will watch as Rome endured, adapted, and returned with a vengeance that would erase this city from the earth. This matters because Carthage shaped the world you live in today. Roman agricultural science was built on Carthaginian knowledge. Harbour engineering across the Mediterranean followed the Kothon's design. The Punic language survived into the era of St. Augustine, centuries after the city's destruction. And the lesson Carthage teaches about the fragile balance between commercial wealth and political unity remains as urgent now as it was 2,000 years ago. This is not a summary. This is not a fragment. This is the complete journey through the rise, the glory, and the fall of an empire that nearly changed the course of Western history. By the end, you will understand not just what happened to Carthage, but why it still matters. If you find yourself drawn to these complete journeys through ancient civilizations, subscribe to join us each week as we bring you the full untold story of a lost world. Share this series with anyone who believes the past still has something vital to teach us. Now let us begin. The Phoenician galleys are setting sail from Tyre, and the shores of North Africa await. The Eastern Mediterranean, sometime around 1100 years before the Common Era. The city of Tyre clings to a rocky island off the Levantine coast, its double harbour crowded with cedar-hulled vessels bearing cargo that will reshape the ancient world. Murex shells by the thousands rot in stone vats along the shoreline, their crushed bodies yielding a secretion that, when exposed to sunlight, transforms into a violet so deep it seems to hold the last light of dusk within its fibres. This is Tyrian purple, worth more than its weight in silver, and the people who harvest it are already the most accomplished sailors the world has ever known. The Phoenicians do not conquer, they trade. From Byblos and Sidon and Tyre, their galleys fan outward in widening arcs, carrying cedarwood, glass beads, bronze tools, and bolts of dyed cloth to every shore they can reach. They establish way stations first, modest anchorages where crews can beach their ships, take on fresh water, and repair storm damage before pressing farther west. Kition on Cyprus, then the coasts of Crete and Malta. Then the shores of Sicily and Sardinia, where tin and copper and silver wait in quantities the Levant cannot match. Each station follows a pattern visible in the archaeological record, a protected cove or promontory, ideally with twin harbours offering shelter regardless of wind direction, a freshwater source nearby, fertile land within reach for provisioning. These are not random landfalls. Phoenician captains read coastlines the way scribes read clay tablets, selecting sites with the precision of engineers. By the 9th century before the Common Era, Tyrian networks stretch from the tin roots of the Atlantic Iberian coast to the grain-rich plains of North Africa. Utica, traditionally dated to around 1100 before the Common Era, already anchors the western end of this chain along the coast of what is now Tunisia. But Utica sits on a river mouth prone to silting. The Tyrians need something better. The Gulf of Tunis offers it. A broad, sheltered bay opens towards the northeast, and within it, a triangular peninsula juts outward between a coastal lagoon and the open sea. The site commands two natural harbours, one facing the lake, one facing the Gulf. A low hill rises at its centre, defensible and visible from the water. The hinterland behind it rolls with some of the richest agricultural soil in North Africa, watered by seasonal rivers and capable of sustaining a population far larger than any trading post requires. Tyrian scouts recognize what this geography promises, not merely another anchorage, but a city. The traditional founding date, 814 years before the Common Era, aligns with the deepest archaeological layers excavated on the slopes of Bursa Hill. Beneath Roman concrete and Hellenistic fill, archaeologists uncover fragments of Phoenician pottery, simple mud-brick wall foundations, and traces of iron slag consistent with late 9th century Levantine metalworking. The material culture of these earliest strata mirrors Tyre almost exactly. The same red slip ware, the same cooking vessels, the same small amulets of Egyptian faience carried as protective charms on long voyages. The legend of Queen Dido, Elissa in the Phoenician tradition, wraps this foundation in a story of exile, cunning, and sacrifice. Whether or not a historical figure stands behind the tale, the narrative preserves something true about the colony's origins. Carthage is born not from imperial decree, but from mercantile ambition and displacement, a daughter city seeking independence from its mother. The name itself carries intention. Carthage, the new city. Not a fortress, not a shrine, but a city, conceived from its first days as something meant to endure, The Phoenician settlers who lay its earliest foundations on that sun-bleached promontory carry with them the accumulated maritime knowledge of 3 centuries of Western expansion, the alphabet that will become the ancestor of Greek and Latin script, and a taste for purple dye that stains their fingers and defines their world. The shore they choose will become the center of an empire. The promontory rises roughly 60 meters above the coastal plain, a limestone hill that the settlers will come to call Barca. Its slopes face the prevailing sea winds, and its summit commands an unbroken view of the Gulf, the distant Cap Bon Peninsula, and the shallow lagoon that separates the headland from the mainland interior. It is here, in the decades following the initial founding, that the colony takes its first permanent shape. The earliest archaeological layers on Barca Hill reveal modest structures of mud brick set upon rubble stone foundations. These are not grand edifices. The walls are thin, the rooms small, the rooflines low and flat in the Levantine tradition. Packed earth floors bear traces of cooking fires and crushed murex shell. Fragments of Tyrian pottery mingle with locally made wares, evidence of a community already adapting its material culture to new circumstances. The settlers build as their ancestors built in the Levant, but the clay beneath their feet is African, reddish, and calcium-rich, and it lends a distinctive warmth to the brickwork that dries under the North African sun. Among the first permanent constructions is a sanctuary dedicated to Astarte, the great goddess of Tyre. The temple precinct occupies elevated ground, oriented towards the sea, its sacred enclosure marked by low walls of dressed sandstone. Votive deposits from these earliest decades include small terracotta figurines, faience amulets of Egyptian origin, and simple stone altars blackened by burnt offerings. The religious architecture follows Phoenician convention, an open-air courtyard surrounding a raised platform where the divine image or sacred betel stands. Worship here is continuous, seasonal, tied to the rhythms of maritime trade and agricultural planting that govern colonial life. Below the hill, along the shoreline, the first harbor installations take form. These are not yet the monumental Kothan of later centuries, but practical anchorages, wooden jetties extending into the shallows, stone quays built from quarried local limestone, beaching ramps where galleys can be hauled ashore for caulking and repair. The natural geography of the site provides 2 distinct embayments, one facing northeast and the other sheltered from open sea swells, a configuration that later engineers will exploit to create the famous double harbor system. The relationship between the Phoenician settlers and the indigenous Libyan populations of the surrounding hinterland proves essential to the colony's survival. Archaeological evidence from burial sites dating to the 8th century before the Common Era reveals a mingling of funerary traditions. Phoenician cremation urns placed alongside graves containing Libyan-style pottery and personal ornaments. Intermarriage occurs. Trade is constant. The Libyans provide grain, livestock, leather, and labor. The Phoenicians offer metalwork, wine, olive oil, and access to the broader Mediterranean exchange network. This symbiosis is not always peaceful, and later traditions preserve memories of tribute payments negotiated with local chieftains, but the fundamental pattern is one of mutual dependence. The necropolis spreading along the lower slopes and coastal flats tells its own story. Rock-cut chamber tombs hold the cremated remains of the settlement's first generations, accompanied by red slip jugs, bronze razors, scarab seals, and ivory combs. The grave goods trace connections radiating outward: Egyptian amulets, Sardinian bronzes, Greek geometric pottery acquired through intermediary trade. Even in death, the people of early Carthage remain embedded in the commercial web that justifies their existence on this foreign shore. By roughly 750 years before the Common Era, the settlement has grown beyond a simple trading station. Residential quarters extend down from Barca Hill toward the harbours. A second sanctuary, likely dedicated to Baal Hammon, appears in the archaeological record. The Tophet, that enigmatic sacred precinct that will generate centuries of scholarly debate, receives its earliest deposits during this period. Small urns containing calcined bones placed beneath carved limestone markers. The population numbers perhaps in the low thousands, a mixture of Tyrian descendants, newer Phoenician arrivals from other colonies, and assimilated Libyans whose children now speak Punic and worship at Levantine altars. The new city has taken root. The transformation unfolds gradually, measured not in dramatic conquests, but in the slow accumulation of commercial influence across the Western Sea. Sometime after 750 before the Common Era, Carthage begins to distinguish itself from the constellation of Phoenician settlements scattered along Mediterranean coastlines. Tyre, the mother city, faces mounting pressure from Assyrian expansion under Tiglath-Pileser III and his successors. Tribute demands drain Tyrian wealth. The great eastern metropolis can no longer sustain the network of distant colonies it once nurtured with ships, settlers, and capital. A vacuum opens in the western Mediterranean, and Carthage moves to fill it. The geography favors this ascent. Positioned at the narrowing of the central Mediterranean, where the North African coast reaches toward Sicily, Carthage commands the passage between the eastern and western basins. Every merchant vessel carrying tin from the Atlantic, silver from Iberia, or grain from the Libyan hinterland must reckon with this promontory. The twin harbours deepen and expand during this century, their quays lined with limestone blocks cut from local quarries. Warehouses multiply along the waterfront, storing amphorae of wine, bundles of dyed textiles, and ingots of raw metal awaiting redistribution. Carthaginian merchant galleys, broad-beamed vessels with rounded hulls designed for cargo rather than speed, push westward along established Phoenician routes. They call at Motia off the western tip of Sicily, at Nora and Sulci on the southern coast of Sardinia, at Ibiza in the Balearic Islands. These older Phoenician foundations, some dating back 2 or 3 centuries, have operated as independent trading posts. Now Carthage begins to weave them into a coordinated network, not yet through military force, but through commercial gravity. Carthaginian merchants offer reliable markets, standardized weights, and access to the increasingly vital North African grain surplus. The Iberian Peninsula draws particular attention. Along its southern coast, Phoenician settlements like Gadir have long exploited the region's extraordinary mineral wealth. Silver flows from mines in the Sierra Morena. Tin arrives overland from sources further north and west, carried along routes that reach toward the Atlantic. These metals are essential to the bronze and silver economies of the entire Mediterranean world. Carthaginian traders establish themselves as intermediaries, their ships carrying Iberian silver eastward and returning with Egyptian faience, Greek pottery, and Levantine luxury goods. Sardinia offers copper and lead alongside fertile agricultural land. Carthaginian presence on the island intensifies during this period, particularly along the southwestern coast, where the settlement at Sulci grows into a significant port. Relations with the indigenous Nuragic peoples of the Sardinian interior remain complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, but the coastal enclaves prosper. The material culture of Carthage during this era reflects its widening horizons. Excavated tombs yield Egyptian scarabs alongside Etruscan bacchero ware, Greek Corinthian pottery beside locally produced red slip vessels. Punic artisans absorb and reinterpret influences from every corner of the Mediterranean, developing a distinctive aesthetic that blends Phoenician traditions with Western innovations. Terracotta masks with exaggerated features begin appearing in burial contexts, their precise ritual function still debated by scholars. The religious landscape deepens as well. The Tophet precinct on the southern edge of the city accumulates successive layers of urns and stelae during this century. The goddess Tanit, who will eventually become Carthage's paramount deity, may already be emerging in the devotional hierarchy alongside Baal Hammon, though her prominence crystallizes more fully in later centuries. By roughly 650 before the Common Era, Carthage has completed a fundamental transition. It is no longer merely one colony among many, but the acknowledged center of Phoenician civilization in the West. Its merchant fleet is the largest in the region. Its harbor facilities are unmatched. Its commercial relationships extend from the Levant to the Atlantic. The old Tyrian colony has become something new, a Western Phoenician capital whose wealth and ambition will soon demand military power to match its economic reach. The wealth demands protection, and protection demands soldiers. Sometime in the mid-7th century before the Common Era, a family known to later historians as the Magonids begins consolidating political and military authority in Carthage. The dynasty's founder, Mago, reorganizes the city's approach to warfare with a single transformative insight. Carthage will not rely on its own citizens to fill the ranks. Instead, it will purchase the finest fighters the Mediterranean can offer. This decision reshapes everything. Numidian horsemen from the interior of North Africa, celebrated for riding without bridles, form the cavalry. Iberian warriors from the mountains of modern Spain bring their distinctive short swords and fierce discipline. Balearic slingers, trained from childhood to hurl lead projectiles with lethal accuracy across extraordinary distances, provide ranged devastation. Libyan infantry, drawn from the agricultural populations surrounding Carthage itself, serve as the heavy core. Greek mercenaries, Sardinian tribesmen, and Gallic fighters supplement these forces depending on the campaign. The result is an army of professional killers bound not by patriotism, but by silver. The Magonids direct this instrument outward. Sardinia, with its copper and grain, becomes a primary target. Carthaginian forces establish fortified positions along the island's southern and western coasts, subduing the indigenous Nuragic populations and displacing earlier Phoenician settlers who had operated independently. Garrison towns rise behind thick sandstone walls. Warehouses fill with Sardinian metal ore destined for Carthaginian foundries. Sicily presents a more complex challenge. The island's western third has long hosted Phoenician trading settlements, Motia on its tiny island connected by causeway to the mainland, Panormus with its deep harbor, Solus perched on its coastal ridge. These communities look to Carthage for military backing against an increasingly aggressive Greek presence. Syracuse, Acragas, Selinus, and Gela expand relentlessly, their populations swelling with new colonists from the Aegean. The cultural frontier between Phoenician West and Greek East hardens into a military one. Carthaginian fortification techniques during this period reflect both Phoenician heritage and original engineering. Walls rise in massive ashlar blocks, their faces carefully dressed, their cores packed with rubble and earth. Towers project at regular intervals, creating overlapping fields of observation. Mottia's defenses grow particularly formidable, a circuit wall enclosing the entire island, its gates narrow and angled to prevent direct assault. The Magonid dynasty also cultivates alliances with strategic precision. Treaties with Etruscan city-states in central Italy create a counterweight against Greek commercial expansion. Around 509 before the Common Era, Carthage negotiates its first known treaty with Rome, then a minor republic of no particular consequence. The agreement delineates trading zones and mutual obligations, revealing Carthage's diplomatic sophistication and its determination to formalize spheres of influence across the Western Mediterranean. At home, the Magonids preside over a city growing denser and more monumental. The harbors undergo continuous improvement. Temple precincts dedicated to Baal-Hamon and the increasingly prominent Tanit receive elaborate stone construction. The Tophet expands as the population grows. Residential quarters spread across the coastal plain below Bursa Hill, their mud brick houses whitewashed against the North African sun, their upper stories overlooking narrow streets that channel sea breezes inland. Yet the dynasty's greatest test approaches from the east. Greek power in Sicily consolidates under ambitious tyrants. Gelon of Syracuse unifies much of eastern Sicily under his authority, creating a military force capable of challenging Carthaginian interests directly. The Western Phoenician settlements send increasingly urgent appeals for support. The Magonid response, when it comes, will be massive, a fleet carrying tens of thousands of mercenaries toward the Sicilian coast, aimed at breaking Greek dominance once and for all. The collision at Himera in 480 before the Common Era will mark the end of the Magonid era and the beginning of a painful reassessment of Carthaginian ambitions in the central Mediterranean. The fleet that crosses from North Africa in the spring of 480 before the Common Era is among the largest military expeditions the Western Mediterranean has ever witnessed. Ancient sources claim 300,000 men, a figure almost certainly inflated, but even conservative modern estimates place the force at several tens of thousands. Libyan infantry, Iberian swordsmen, Sardinian auxiliaries, Ligurian javelin throwers, and a Carthaginian officer corps commanding this polyglot army. Hamilcar, the Magonid general, leads the expedition personally. His warships and transports darken the waters between Cape Bon and the Sicilian coast, a crossing of roughly 200 kilometers that takes the fleet towards the northern shore of the island. The destination is Himera, a Greek colony perched on a coastal terrace where a small river meets the Tyrrhenian Sea. Theron, tyrant of Akragas, has seized the city and expelled its former ruler, who appeals to Carthage for restoration. The pretext serves Magonid ambitions perfectly. Hamilcar beaches his fleet west of the city and establishes a fortified naval camp along the shore, hauling vessels onto the sand and surrounding them with a timber palisade and ditch. A second camp rises on higher ground for the land forces. Between these positions and the city walls, the terrain opens into a coastal plain bisected by the river, ground that favors neither cavalry nor heavy infantry decisively. Gelon of Syracuse arrives with a relief force drawn from across eastern Sicily. His army numbers perhaps 30 to 50,000, predominantly Greek hoplites trained in the disciplined phalanx formation that has proven devastating in set-piece engagements. The Carthaginian force, though possibly larger, lacks this cohesion. Its mercenary contingents fight in their own national styles, coordinated by Carthaginian officers, but never fully integrated into a single tactical system. The battle unfolds with catastrophic speed. Greek cavalry strikes the naval camp at dawn, catching the Carthaginian position in disorder. Fire spreads among the beached ships, consuming timber hulls and rigging in columns of black smoke visible for kilometers along the coast. The land army, deprived of its naval base and supply line, fragments under coordinated Greek assault. The mercenary contingents, fighting without unified command, break apart piecemeal. Hamilcar himself perishes during the engagement. Some traditions claim he throws himself into a sacrificial fire when defeat becomes certain, others that he falls in the fighting at the naval camp. His death extinguishes the Magonid dynasty's military prestige in a single afternoon. The losses are staggering. Thousands of mercenaries are killed or captured. The surviving fleet limps back to Africa with only a fraction of the force that departed weeks earlier. Gelon imposes terms that include a massive indemnity of 2,000 talents of silver, a sum that strains even Carthaginian treasuries. The victory elevates Syracuse to unchallenged dominance over eastern and central Sicily, confining Carthaginian influence to the island's western corner. Motia, Panormus, and Solus remain in the Punic orbit. But the dream of controlling all Sicily dies on the beach at Himera. The consequences ripple through Carthaginian society for generations. The political system shifts away from dynastic military command. The Council of Elders and the Tribunal of Judges, known later as the 104, gain authority at the expense of individual generals, establishing checks against the concentration of power that led to the Himera disaster. Military commanders will henceforth answer to civilian oversight, their campaigns scrutinized, their failures punished severely, sometimes by crucifixion. Carthage turns inward and southward. The African hinterland receives renewed attention, its agricultural potential developed systematically. Trade networks are reinforced rather than extended by force. For 70 years, Carthaginian armies do not return to eastern Sicily in strength. The city rebuilds its wealth quietly, patiently, channeling resources into commerce rather than conquest. The temples of Tanit and Baal Hamon receive lavish dedications from merchants whose fortunes grow in the decades of peace. The Tophet fills with new stelae, carved in soft sandstone, recording vows fulfilled and blessings received. Carthage absorbs the lesson of Himera not as a reason for despair, but as a catalyst for transformation, from a dynasty's military adventure into something more durable, more calculating, and ultimately more dangerous. That calculating patience extends beyond the African hinterland and the familiar sea lanes of the central Mediterranean. Sometime around 500 years before the Common Era, Carthage turns its gaze toward the unknown waters beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the narrow strait where the Mediterranean exhales into the vast Atlantic. The city dispatches 2 extraordinary expeditions, each probing a different edge of the known world, and both revealing a geographic ambition unmatched by any contemporary power. The more celebrated voyage belongs to Hanno, a suffet or high-ranking commander whose account survives in a Greek translation inscribed, according to tradition, on a bronze tablet dedicated at the temple of Baal-Hamon. His fleet numbers 60 pentacontas, long, shallow-drafted vessels each carrying perhaps 50 oarsmen alongside colonists and supplies. The expedition's stated purpose is the founding of settlements along the Atlantic coast of North Africa, a strategy designed to secure Carthaginian access to the gold, ivory, and exotic goods filtering northward through trans-Saharan trade networks. The ships pass through the strait and turn south. Along the Moroccan coast, Hanno establishes or reinforces a series of colonies: Timia Tyrion, Karikontaikos, Gita, Accra, Melita, and Arambis, planting Carthaginian populations at intervals along the shoreline. The fleet continues beyond these settlements into waters no Phoenician vessel has charted. Hanno's account describes a great river teeming with crocodiles and hippopotami, likely the Senegal or the Gambia. Further south, the expedition encounters volcanic activity, a towering mountain ablaze with fire that modern scholars have tentatively identified as Mount Cameroon, though some place it closer to the volcanic peaks of the Canary Islands or the Guinea coast. The narrative grows stranger as the fleet pushes deeper into equatorial waters. Dense forests press against the shoreline. The air thickens with heat. Hanno describes encountering hairy, aggressive creatures that his interpreters call gorillae, a term later borrowed by modern zoology, though whether these were gorillas, chimpanzees, or a misidentified human population remains debated. The expedition captures 3 females but cannot subdue them, eventually killing them and preserving their skins to bring home as proof. Meanwhile, a second commander named Himilco sails in the opposite direction, northward beyond the Pillars into the cold Atlantic waters off the European coast. His voyage, known primarily through fragments preserved by the Roman poet Avienus, writing centuries later, reaches the tin-producing regions of Brittany and possibly the British Isles. Himilco reports shallow, weed-choked seas, becalmed waters, and thick fog, descriptions consistent with the Sargasso-like conditions of the Bay of Biscay and the Celtic Shelf. The strategic purpose is transparent. Carthage seeks direct access to the tin deposits of northwestern Europe, bypassing the overland routes controlled by intermediaries. These expeditions reveal the sophistication of Carthaginian shipbuilding. The pentacontas used by Hanno are designed for coastal navigation, their shallow drafts allowing them to navigate river mouths and anchor close to shore. Hulls are constructed from Lebanese cedar and North African pine, planks joined edge to edge with mortise and tenon joints sealed with pitch and beeswax. Rigging combines a single square sail for open water passages with oar power for maneuvering along unfamiliar coastlines. Freshwater casks, dried fish, grain, and salted meat sustain crews for months beyond the reach of any friendly port. The geographic knowledge accumulated by these voyages gives Carthage an intelligence advantage that it guards jealously. Later sources suggest that Carthaginian captains deliberately spread terrifying stories about Atlantic waters, sea monsters, boiling shallows, impenetrable fog, to discourage Greek and Roman competitors from following their routes. The policy works. For centuries, no rival Mediterranean power successfully challenges Carthaginian dominance of the Atlantic trade corridors. The bronze tablet in the Temple of Baal-Hamon stands as both a devotional offering and a strategic archive. Its text maps a world far larger than the enclosed Mediterranean basin, a world of volcanic coasts and equatorial forests and tin-bearing islands shrouded in northern mist. Carthage, barely 3 centuries old, already comprehends the shape of the Western world more completely than any civilization of its age. That comprehension of distant coastlines and foreign waters demands infrastructure of extraordinary ambition closer to home. By the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era, Carthage undertakes the most sophisticated harbor engineering project the ancient Mediterranean has ever witnessed. The site chosen lies along the southeastern edge of the city, where the coastline curves inward to form a shallow lagoon connected to the open gulf by a narrow channel. Here, Carthaginian engineers begin reshaping the earth itself. The commercial harbor comes first. Workers excavate a vast rectangular basin from the soft coastal sediment, reinforcing its walls with carefully fitted sandstone blocks quarried from the Cap Bon Peninsula. The dimensions are staggering, roughly 450 meters in length, sufficient to accommodate dozens of merchant vessels simultaneously. Stone quays line every edge, and behind them rise warehouses built from limestone rubble set in clay mortar, their roofs tiled with terracotta to shed the winter rains. Amphorae from Iberia, grain sacks from the Sahel, copper ingots from Sardinia, all of it flows through this single engineered throat connecting Carthage to the wealth of the Western world. But the true marvel lies beyond, deeper within the city's body. Connected to the commercial port by a narrow, navigable channel stands the Kothon, the circular military harbor. Its design has no precedent. A perfectly round basin, roughly 325 meters in diameter, surrounds a central island. Along the inner circumference and around the island's perimeter, ship sheds radiate outward like the spokes of a wheel, individual covered berths carved into the quayside, each one precisely sized to shelter a single warship. Archaeological excavation reveals the foundations of approximately 170 of these sheds, though ancient sources claim the harbor accommodates over 200 vessels. Each ship shed slopes gently downward toward the water, allowing crews to drag hulls onto dry ground for maintenance. The keels of Carthaginian warships rest on timber cradles, their hulls exposed for scraping, recaulking, and the application of pitch and wax to reduce marine growth. The central island houses the Admiralty House, a raised command structure from which harbor operations are coordinated, and the entire circular basin surveyed without obstruction. The warships themselves represent generations of refined Phoenician naval tradition. Carthaginian shipwrights construct triremes and later quadriremes using a shell-first technique inherited from Tyre. Planks are joined edge to edge with precisely cut mortise and tenon joints, locked with hardwood pegs, creating a hull of remarkable rigidity before any internal framing is added. Cedar from the mountains of the Maghreb and pine from Sardinia provide the primary timber. The bronze ram at the prow, a weapon designed to punch through enemy hulls at ramming speed, is cast in molds and fitted to a reinforced stem post. The fleet organization mirrors the discipline of the harbor's geometry. Crews are drawn from Carthage's citizen population, unlike the mercenary armies that fight on land. Rowing a warship demands coordination that only permanent, trained crews can sustain. Each vessel carries roughly 200 oarsmen arranged on multiple levels, along with a complement of Marines armed for boarding actions. A single massive wall encloses both harbors, pierced by one entrance from the sea, a channel barely wide enough for two ships to pass abreast. This choke point can be sealed with iron chains stretched across its mouth, transforming the entire complex into an impregnable fortress. From the open gulf, nothing of the military harbor is visible. The commercial port screens it entirely, so that foreign merchants docking to unload cargo cannot observe the strength or disposition of the Carthaginian fleet. By the late 4th century before the Common Era, the Kothon stands as the operational heart of Carthaginian naval supremacy. No other Mediterranean power possesses anything comparable, not Syracuse, not Athens in its diminished state, not the emerging cities of the Italian peninsula. The harbour functions simultaneously as shipyard, dry dock, arsenal, and strategic command centre. Its circular perfection embodies a civilization that thinks in systems rather than monuments, that measures greatness not in temples alone, but in the capacity to project force across vast stretches of open water. The sea that Carthage comprehends so thoroughly now rests, tamed and contained, within walls of its own making. The tamed harbour radiates influence outward, along routes that by the 4th century before the Common Era form the most extensive commercial network in the Western Mediterranean. Carthaginian trade is not a single current, but a web of interlocking exchanges, each strand reinforcing the others, each commodity flowing through channels refined over generations of accumulated mercantile intelligence. Silver arrives from Iberia in quantities that astonish the ancient world. Mines in the hinterland beyond Gades yield ore of extraordinary purity, extracted by thousands of labourers working shafts that descend deep into the earth. Carthaginian merchants control the supply chain from pithead to smelter to ingot, shipping standardized bars across the sea in broad-hulled transport vessels. This silver underwrites the city's capacity to hire mercenaries, purchase grain surpluses, and maintain diplomatic leverage with every power from Syracuse to the Etruscan cities of central Italy. Tin flows southward from the Atlantic coasts of Iberia, and possibly from sources even farther north, traded through intermediaries along river systems that Carthaginian captains guard with fierce commercial secrecy. Combined with copper from Sardinia and Cyprus, this tin feeds bronze workshops across North Africa and beyond. The alloy remains essential for fittings, tools, decorative objects, and ritual vessels, even as iron increasingly dominates weaponry. Grain constitutes the quieter fortune. The fertile plains of the Bagradus River Valley and the Cap Bon Peninsula produce wheat and barley harvests of remarkable abundance. Estate owners employing techniques later codified in Margot's treatises cultivate the hinterland with systematic efficiency. Surplus grain moves through the commercial harbour in sacks loaded aboard vessels, bound for markets wherever drought or war has disrupted local supply. This agricultural wealth provides Carthage with a strategic commodity as powerful as any precious metal. Textiles dyed with Tyrian purple remain the prestige export that links Carthage to its Phoenician ancestry. Workshops along the coastal margins process murex shells by the tens of thousands, crushing the mollusks to extract the glandular secretion that yields colors ranging from deep violet to reddish crimson. The stench of these operations is legendary, but the finished cloth commands prices that justify every discomfort. Cheaper imitations using plant-based dyes circulate alongside the genuine article, but discerning buyers across the Mediterranean recognize authentic Carthaginian purple by its resistance to fading. Pottery, both locally produced and redistributed from Greek and Etruscan sources, fills the cargo holds of merchant ships alongside amphorae containing olive oil, salted fish, and wine. Carthaginian amphorae bear distinctive forms, recognizable at archaeological sites from the Moroccan Atlantic coast to the shores of the Aegean. These ceramic containers function as the standardized shipping units of ancient commerce, their shapes evolving gradually across decades to accommodate different commodities and stacking requirements. The enslaved constitute another commodity moving through Carthaginian markets, drawn from warfare, piracy, debt, and trade with interior African and Iberian populations. They labor on agricultural estates, in mining operations, in domestic service, and aboard the galleys themselves. This traffic, unremarkable by the moral standards of the ancient Mediterranean, forms an integral component of the economic system that sustains Carthaginian prosperity. The commercial quarter of the city itself hums with activity. Warehouse districts near the rectangular merchant harbour store goods awaiting redistribution. Scales and standardized weights ensure transactional consistency. Money changers convert currencies from dozens of minting authorities. The agora functions as both marketplace and information exchange, where captains report conditions at distant ports and merchants negotiate contracts for future deliveries. This commercial architecture operates without the centralized state direction characteristic of Eastern empires. Private enterprise, family trading houses, and partnerships drive the system, though the state collects harbor dues, regulates weights and measures, and negotiates the treaties that secure access to foreign markets. The result is an economy of remarkable flexibility, capable of absorbing shocks and redirecting trade flows when political circumstances shift. Wealth accumulates not in royal treasuries, but in the hands of merchant families whose influence shapes policy through the councils of government. By 300 before the Common Era, this commercial empire generates revenues that rival the great kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean, all flowing through harbors built to contain the sea itself. Those revenues flow not only through counting houses and harbor officers, but also upward, toward the gods who guarantee Carthage's fortune. The spiritual architecture of the city is as deliberate as its commercial infrastructure, and at its center stand two deities whose power saturates every layer of Carthaginian life. Baal-Hamon, lord of fertility and cosmic order, and Tanit, whose sign, a triangle surmounted by a disc and horizontal bar, appears on thousands of carved limestone stelae across the western Mediterranean. The earliest traces of organized worship at Carthage reach back to the 8th century before the Common Era, when settlers from Tyre carry with them the religious traditions of the Levantine coast. Temples rise on Byrsa Hill and along the shoreline, their sanctuaries oriented toward celestial phenomena, their altars blackened by centuries of burnt offerings. Priestly families maintain hereditary control over sacred precincts, performing rites whose precise liturgy remains only partially recoverable from inscriptions. What survives reveals a theology of reciprocity. The gods provide rain, safe passage, and military victory, and the faithful return offerings of incense, animal sacrifice, and dedicated wealth. No site embodies Carthaginian religion more powerfully or more controversially than the Tophet, the open-air sanctuary discovered near the commercial harbor. Excavations reveal layer upon layer of urns containing cremated remains, each deposit marked by a limestone stele carved with the sign of Tanit, dedications to Baal Hammon, and images of priests with raised hands. The earliest deposits date to approximately 800 before the Common Era. The latest belong to the city's final century. Between these extremes lie thousands of individual offerings spanning 500 years of continuous ritual use. The contents of these urns ignite one of archaeology's most enduring debates. Ancient Greek and Roman authors describe child sacrifice at Carthage with horrified fascination, and some urns do contain the bones of very young children. Yet careful osteological analysis reveals that many urns hold the remains of stillborn infants or children who died in the first weeks of life, alongside the bones of lambs and kids substituted as offerings. The Tophet may function simultaneously as a sacrificial precinct and a sacred cemetery for children lost before naming ceremonies, a place where grief and devotion merge in ways that resist simple categorization. The stelae themselves constitute the largest corpus of Punic religious art. Carved from local limestone, they range from rough pillars bearing only the Tanit symbol to elaborate compositions featuring incense altars, caduceus motifs, crescent moons, and stylized palm trees. Some bear lengthy inscriptions identifying the dedicant, the deity addressed, and the nature of the vow fulfilled. The formulaic phrase appearing most frequently translates roughly as a gift offered by a specific individual to the Lady Tanit and the Lord Baal Hammon, because the deity heard the prayer. These dedications reveal a personal, transactional relationship between worshipper and God. Beyond the Tophet, terracotta figurines recovered from domestic contexts and tombs depict female figures with elaborate headdresses, their arms extended in gestures of blessing or supplication. Masks of grotesque or apotropaic design appear in burial contexts intended to ward off malevolent spirits. Amulets bearing Egyptian motifs, the Eye of Horus, the dwarf god Bez, circulate alongside purely Phoenician sacred objects, reflecting the cosmopolitan absorption that characterizes Carthaginian culture. The priestly hierarchy administers not only ritual, but also significant economic resources. Temple estates hold agricultural land. Sacred treasuries accumulate dedications of gold, silver, and bronze. Priests regulate festival calendars that punctuate the commercial year, binding the rhythms of trade to the rhythms of worship. By the 4th century before the Common Era, the cult of Tanit achieves such prominence that her symbol functions almost as a civic emblem, stamped on coins, painted on ship prows, and carved into the thresholds of private homes. Religion and identity become inseparable, and the sacred precinct endures as the spiritual heart of a civilization whose gods demand constant remembrance. That civic emblem adorning coins and thresholds belongs to a city governed not by monarchs, but by a constitutional order that Aristotle himself, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, ranks among the finest in the known world. His praise is remarkable. In the politics, the philosopher compares Carthage favorably to Sparta and Crete, noting that its constitution has never produced a serious civil war, nor suffered the rule of a tyrant, an achievement few Greek cities can claim. At the apex of this system stand the two sufes, magistrates elected annually who inherit the executive authority once held by the Magonid generals. The title itself descends from the Phoenician word shophet, meaning judge, and the office carries judicial, administrative, and ceremonial functions without permanent military command. This separation of civil and military power proves deliberate. After the catastrophe at Himera and the turbulent decades that follow, Carthage evolves a system designed to prevent any single family from accumulating unchecked authority. The Sophes preside over the council, propose legislation, and oversee treaties, but they cannot wage war on their own initiative. Military commands are granted separately, often to generals who hold no civil office, creating a tension between political and martial power that defines Carthaginian statecraft for 2 centuries. Below the Sophes sits the Council of Elders, a body of several hundred members drawn from the wealthiest and most distinguished families. This council deliberates on matters of foreign policy, finance, and military appointments. Within it operates a smaller inner council, sometimes called the Tribunal of 104, charged with scrutinizing the conduct of generals returning from campaign. Its power is fearsome. Commanders who fail face investigation, and punishments include heavy fines, exile, and even crucifixion. The intent is accountability, but the effect sometimes paralyzes military initiative, as generals weigh battlefield decisions against political consequences awaiting them at home. The popular assembly provides a third pillar. When the Sophes and council cannot reach agreement, disputed matters pass to the assembled citizens for resolution. This mechanism prevents deadlock and gives the broader population a voice that, while constrained, exceeds what most ancient oligarchies permit. Aristotle observes that Carthage blends oligarchic and democratic elements with unusual sophistication, allowing wealth to determine access to office while preserving popular consent as a constitutional safeguard. The physical spaces of governance reflect this layered authority. The agora near the harbour district serves as the gathering place for public deliberation. Limestone administrative buildings line its edges, their interiors organized around columned courtyards where scribes maintain records on papyrus and wax tablets. Inscriptions in Punic script record decrees, dedications, and financial accounts. The architecture is functional rather than monumental, favoring enclosed spaces suited to committee work over the grand open theatres of Greek democratic life. Revenue administration demands particular sophistication. The council oversees taxation of trade, tribute from subject territories in Libya and Sardinia, and income from state-owned mines in Iberia. Treasury officials manage disbursements for fleet maintenance, mercenary wages, and public construction. This fiscal machinery sustains the largest professional military in the Western Mediterranean, without requiring the citizen-soldier model that defines Rome and the Greek polis. Yet the system carries inherent vulnerabilities. The reliance on mercenary armies means that political authority and military loyalty rarely align. The dominance of wealthy families within the council concentrates power among commercial elites whose interests sometimes diverge from strategic necessity. And the scrutiny imposed on returning generals, while preventing tyranny, discourages the bold, sustained campaigns that territorial expansion demands. Carthage governs with remarkable stability through the 4th century before the Common Era, but the constitutional caution that prevents dictatorship also fragments decision-making at moments requiring unified resolve. The Republic endures, prosperous and orderly, its institutions admired even by its future enemies, yet carrying within their careful balances the seeds of hesitation that a more ruthless adversary will one day exploit. That constitutional order, for all its caution, presides over a city whose material culture rivals anything produced in the Greek or Persian worlds. The workshops lining the streets south of Barca Hill and clustered near the commercial harbour hum with activity through the 5th, 4th, and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, producing objects of startling refinement from materials gathered across 3 continents. Ivory arrives from the African interior, transported overland through Libyan intermediaries, or shipped from trading posts along the Atlantic coast. Carthaginian carvers transform raw tusks into plaques, combs, and furniture inlays of extraordinary delicacy. Panels depicting sphinxes, palmettes, and lotus blossoms blend Egyptian and Phoenician motifs into something distinctly Western Punic. The craftsmanship demands years of apprenticeship. Each piece requires precise understanding of the material's grain, its tendency to split along certain planes, the way firelight catches beveled edges. These ivories appear in tombs across Sardinia, Ibiza, and the North African hinterland, markers of elite status distributed through networks only Carthaginian commerce can sustain. Jewelry workshops operate nearby, producing gold earrings, pendants, and amulets using granulation techniques inherited from Levantine goldsmiths. Tiny spheres of gold, each smaller than a grain of sand, are fused onto surfaces to create patterns of astonishing intricacy. Crescent moons, solar discs, and the sign of Tanit recur across rings and necklaces recovered from necropolis burials spanning centuries. The consistency of these symbols across generations suggests organized guild production rather than individual artistry. Terracotta masks present perhaps the most haunting artifacts. Grotesque faces with exaggerated grimaces, hollow eyes, and twisted mouths emerge from molds in funerary workshops. Some bear traces of red and white pigment. Their purpose remains debated. Apotropaic guardians warding off evil, ritual objects placed with the dead, or theatrical pieces used in religious ceremonies. They appear in graves from the 6th century onward, their stylistic evolution trackable across 300 years of continuous production. The mosaic tradition develops more gradually, drawing on Hellenistic influence while retaining Punic geometric preferences. Floors in wealthier residences feature tessellated patterns in black, white, and terracotta stone, abstract designs favoring interlocking diamonds and wave borders rather than the figural scenes preferred in Greek houses. The technique demands specialized knowledge of setting beds, stone cutting, and adhesive preparation using lime and volcanic ash. But no craft defines Carthage more completely than purple dye production. The process begins with harvesting murex sea snails from coastal waters, cracking their shells, and extracting a tiny mucus gland from each animal. Thousands of shells yield mere grams of usable secretion. The extracted fluid, initially yellowish-white, undergoes chemical transformation through careful exposure to sunlight and controlled fermentation in stone vats. The stench is legendary. Ancient sources describe dye works banished to city outskirts because the rotting organic matter produces an almost unbearable odor. Yet the result justifies every difficulty. Tyrian purple, ranging from deep violet to reddish crimson depending on processing duration and species mixture, bonds permanently to wool and linen fibers, growing more luminous with washing rather than fading. A single pound of dyed wool commands prices equivalent to skilled laborers' annual wages. Archaeological excavations along the Carthaginian coastline reveal massive deposits of crushed murex shells, some mounds meters deep, testament to industrial-scale production sustained across centuries. The dye becomes synonymous with Punic identity itself, the very word Phoenician likely deriving from the Greek term for this crimson color. Sandstone and soft limestone quarried from the Capbon Peninsula provide building material for temples, public buildings, and elite residences. Masons cut blocks with iron tools, fitting them with precision that minimizes mortar requirements. Residential quarters use mud brick on stone foundations, walls whitewashed against the Mediterranean sun, rooms arranged around central light wells in a pattern that maximizes ventilation in the North African heat. Construction techniques remain remarkably stable across generations, pragmatic rather than monumental, designed for comfort and commerce rather than imperial display. The artisans of Carthage leave behind not grand philosophical treatises on beauty, but something more enduring, objects of such technical mastery that they survive in museum cases and excavation trenches, still radiating the skill and patience of hands that shaped them. Those hands that shaped ivory and terracotta also work the earth. Beyond the city walls, beyond the necropolis and the suburban villas, the landscape opens into one of the most productive agricultural zones in the ancient Mediterranean. The Cape Bon Peninsula stretches northeast, its red soil rich with iron, its rainfall more generous than almost anywhere else in North Africa. The Bagradus River Valley, the modern Medjugorje, fans westward in a broad alluvial plain where wheat and barley grow in quantities sufficient to feed not only Carthage, but its armies, its mercenaries, and its trading partners across the sea. By the 4th century before the Common Era, this hinterland has become the true engine of Carthaginian wealth, rivaling even the silver mines of Iberia and the revenues of the harbor. The estates that blanket this territory operate on a scale that anticipates the great latifundia of Roman Italy. Landholding families of the Carthaginian elite control vast tracts worked by enslaved laborers and tenant farmers drawn from the indigenous Libyan population. Olive groves march in disciplined rows across hillsides too steep for grain. Fig orchards and pomegranate trees fill the intermediate valleys. Vineyards produce wine that Carthaginian merchants export in distinctive amphorae found from the Balearic Islands to the coasts of Egypt. Irrigation channels cut through the drier southern margins, directing seasonal runoff into cisterns and holding ponds that extend the growing season well beyond what rainfall alone permits. The intellectual architecture behind this productivity finds its fullest expression in the treatise of Mago, a Carthaginian writer whose 28 volumes on agriculture constitute the most comprehensive farming manual of the ancient world. The original Punic text does not survive, but its influence echoes through Roman literature with extraordinary persistence. When the Roman Senate orders the destruction of Carthage in 146 before the Common Era, it simultaneously decrees that Mago's work alone among all Carthaginian writings shall be translated into Latin. Columella, Varro, and Pliny the Elder cite Mago repeatedly across the following centuries, crediting him with detailed instructions on soil preparation, grafting techniques, livestock management, and the optimal spacing of olive trees. His recommendations on viniculture shape Roman practice for generations. The sophistication extends beyond written theory. Archaeological evidence from the Carthaginian hinterland, reveals pressing installations for olive oil production, storage facilities capable of holding surplus across multiple seasons, and road networks connecting inland estates to coastal ports where agricultural goods transfer onto merchant vessels. Grain from the Bagradus Valley travels to Carthage's rectangular commercial harbour, where it loads onto ships bound for Iberia, Sicily, and Sardinia. Olive oil moves in the same currents, packed in amphorae stamped with marks identifying estate and quality. This agricultural mastery transforms Carthage's strategic position. A city that can feed itself and its dependencies from its own territory possesses a resilience that purely commercial wealth cannot guarantee. The fertile plains also attract the ambitions of Numidian kingdoms pressing from the west and south, creating tensions that simmer through the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era. Control of farmland becomes inseparable from military strategy, and the great estates serve as recruiting grounds and supply bases during the wars that consume Carthage's final century. The Romans who eventually inherit this landscape recognize its value immediately. North Africa becomes Rome's granary, and the agricultural techniques pioneered under Carthaginian management persist through centuries of Roman provincial administration. Mago's translated words continue circulating among Italian landowners long after the city that produced them lies in ashes. The fields endure, indifferent to the flags that fly above them, yielding their harvests to whoever understands the rhythms of soil, water, and season that Carthaginian farmers mastered first. Those fertile hinterlands supply more than grain and olive oil. They provision armies, and by the late 4th century before the Common Era, Carthage finds itself drawn once more into the grinding warfare that has defined Sicily for generations. The island remains divided, its western third held by Carthaginian garrisons stationed in fortified cities like Lilybaeum, Panormus, and Mottia's successor settlements, while the eastern half orbits Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city west of mainland Greece. Between these spheres, smaller communities shift allegiance with every campaign season, and the boundary between Punic and Greek influence bleeds across the landscape like water through limestone. Around 315 before the Common Era, Agathocles seizes power in Syracuse through a brutal coup, massacring oligarchic opponents and declaring himself strategos autocrator. His ambition extends immediately westward, and Carthage responds with overwhelming force, dispatching Hamilcar son of Gisco with a massive army that pins Agathocles behind the walls of Syracuse by 311. The siege tightens. Carthaginian warships blockade the great harbour. Victory seems inevitable. Then Agathocles does something unprecedented. Rather than endure starvation, he loads 14,000 soldiers onto 60 ships, breaks through the naval cordon, and sails directly for North Africa. Within days, Greek troops are burning Carthaginian estates in the Cap Bon Peninsula, the very farmland that Mago's treatises celebrate. Panic grips the city. Temples fill with desperate offerings. Carthage recalls forces from Sicily to defend the homeland, and the siege of Syracuse collapses. For nearly 4 years, Agathocles campaigns across the Carthaginian hinterland, winning battles, forging alliances with Libyan populations resentful of Punic taxation, and threatening the capital itself. Carthaginian commanders eventually contain and defeat his forces, but only after enormous expenditure of treasure and lives. Agathocles escapes back to Sicily, abandoning his own army, and negotiates a peace that essentially restores pre-war boundaries. The episode reveals a devastating vulnerability. Carthage's North African heartland lies, exposed to any enemy bold enough to cross the sea. A generation later, another threat materializes from an unexpected direction. Pyrrhus of Epirus, the brilliant Hellenistic king who has already bloodied Rome in southern Italy, crosses to Sicily in 278 before the Common Era at the invitation of Syracuse. His professional Macedonian-style army sweeps westward with terrifying efficiency. Carthaginian fortress after fortress falls. Eryx capitulates. Panormus opens its gates. Even the great stronghold of Lilybaeum, ringed by its formidable walls and protected by marshes and sea, comes under siege, though it holds firm against Pyrrhus's assault. For a brief season, Carthage faces the nightmare of losing Sicily entirely. The Punic fleet maintains supply lines to Lilybaeum, while diplomats work furiously, and Carthage even coordinates with Rome against their common enemy. But Pyrrhus's arrogance alienates his Sicilian Greek allies. His demands for absolute authority, his execution of political opponents, and his requisitioning of temple treasures erode support city by city. By 275, he withdraws from the island, reportedly declaring that he leaves Sicily as a wrestling ground for Rome and Carthage. The remark proves prophetic. With Pyrrhus gone, Carthage reasserts control over western Sicily, rebuilding garrisons and strengthening the fortifications at Lilybaeum that had withstood even Epirote siegecraft. The massive walls, some sections 8 meters thick, incorporate defensive towers at regular intervals, and the harbor allows resupply by sea even during prolonged investment. These engineering achievements represent decades of accumulated military knowledge. Yet the decades of Sicilian warfare extract a cumulative toll. Carthage relies increasingly on mercenary forces, Libyan infantry, Numidian cavalry, Iberian swordsmen, Balearic slingers, Campanian horsemen, each group requiring payment in coin, not patriotic sentiment. The financial burden grows with every campaign. Meanwhile, across the narrow strait of Messana, a new power watches Sicily with hungry attention. Rome, having subdued Pyrrhus and consolidated control over peninsular Italy, now stands closer to Carthaginian territory than ever before. The wrestling ground awaits its next contestants. The Strait of Messina is barely 3 kilometers wide, a sliver of turquoise water separating Sicily from the Italian peninsula, and in 264 before the Common Era, it becomes the fault line between two civilizations. A band of Campanian mercenaries called the Mamertines, having seized the Sicilian city of Messana years earlier, finds itself squeezed between Syracuse and Carthage. Desperate, the Mamertines appeal to Rome. The Roman Senate hesitates, but the popular assembly votes for intervention. Roman troops cross the strait, and for the first time, legions stand on ground Carthage considers its own. The collision is not inevitable, but it is structural. Carthage controls western Sicily, dominates the surrounding sea lanes, and views the island as essential to its commercial architecture. Rome, having absorbed the Greek cities of southern Italy, now possesses coastline facing Carthaginian waters. Neither power can tolerate the other's expansion without conceding strategic advantage. The war that follows will last 23 years and reshape the Mediterranean world. Carthage enters the conflict confident in its naval supremacy. Its quinqueremes, warships propelled by 270 oarsmen, arranged in banks of 5 dock, represent generations of Phoenician shipbuilding tradition. These vessels are faster, more maneuverable, and commanded by experienced captains who know every current and headland from Libya to Sardinia. Rome, by contrast, possesses almost no war fleet. Its strength lies in disciplined infantry, in the legionary who fights hand-to-hand with javelin and short sword. The sea is alien territory. Yet Rome adapts with terrifying speed. According to ancient sources, Roman engineers capture a beached Carthaginian quinquereme and use it as a template, constructing an entire fleet within 60 days. The ships are rougher, heavier, less elegant than their Punic counterparts. But Roman ingenuity adds a decisive innovation. The corvus, a hinged boarding bridge fitted with an iron spike at its tip. When a Roman vessel closes with an enemy ship, the corvus drops, its spike biting into the Carthaginian deck, locking the two hulls together. Naval combat becomes infantry combat. The sea becomes a battlefield where Roman soldiers can fight as they do on land. At Mylae in 260 before the Common Era, this device proves devastating. The Carthaginian fleet, accustomed to ramming tactics and graceful maneuver, finds itself pinned and boarded. Roman marines pour across the corvus bridges and overwhelm crews trained for seamanship rather than close-quarters killing. Carthage loses dozens of warships in a single engagement. The Western Mediterranean's unchallenged naval power suffers a shock it has never experienced. The war grinds through Sicily for years, sieges of Agrigentum, skirmishes along coastal fortifications, neither side able to deliver a decisive blow on land. Then Rome escalates dramatically. In 256 before the Common Era, at the Battle of Cape Ecnomus off the southern Sicilian coast, Roman and Carthaginian fleets clash in one of the largest naval engagements of antiquity, involving perhaps 600 warships and nearly 300,000 men. Rome prevails again, and the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus leads a Roman expeditionary force across open water to North Africa itself. For the first time, enemy soldiers march on Carthaginian soil. Regulus lands near Cape Bon, ravages the fertile Cap Bon Peninsula, and advances toward Carthage. The hinterland that Mago's treatises celebrated, those orderly estates with their olive presses and grain stores, burns under Roman torches. Panic grips the city. Carthage sues for peace, but Regulus demands terms so harsh that the council rejects them. Instead, Carthage hires the Spartan mercenary commander Xanthippus, who reorganizes the Punic army, integrating war elephants with disciplined infantry formations and Numidian cavalry on the wings. At the Battle of Tunis in 255 before the Common Era, Xanthippus springs his trap. Elephants shatter the Roman center while Numidian horsemen envelop the flanks. The Roman expeditionary force is annihilated. Regulus himself is captured. The survivors who escape by sea encounter a catastrophic storm that destroys most of the rescue fleet, drowning thousands. Africa is saved, but Sicily remains contested. The war is far from over. Both powers have now tasted devastating loss, and neither possesses the will to concede. The war grinds on. After the catastrophe at Tunis and the storms that swallow Rome's fleets, the conflict in Sicily settles into a brutal stalemate that will consume both powers for another 14 years. Neither side can deliver a decisive blow, and the island becomes a landscape of siege lines, burned harvests, and exhausted garrisons clinging to fortified hilltops. Rome rebuilds its navy, loses it again to storms, rebuilds once more, and loses it yet again. Between 255 and 249 before the Common Era, the Republic suffers repeated naval disasters, not only in battle but through the Mediterranean's savage autumn weather, which wrecks hundreds of warships against the rocky southern coasts of Sicily and Sardinia. Roman senators begin to question whether the sea itself has turned against them. For a time, the Republic effectively abandons large-scale naval operations, a staggering concession for a power that had staked everything on contesting Carthaginian maritime supremacy. Yet on land, Rome holds. Its legions occupy most of eastern and central Sicily, garrisoning towns and slowly tightening the perimeter around Carthage's remaining strongholds in the island's western corner, Lilybaeum, Drepana, and the fortress of Eryx. These positions, perched on cliffs overlooking the sea and supplied by Carthaginian warships, prove nearly impossible to take by direct assault. At Drepana in 249 before the Common Era, Carthage wins its greatest naval victory of the entire war. The Carthaginian commander Adherbal catches a Roman fleet attempting a surprise attack in the confined waters of the harbour. Punic warships, manned by experienced Phoenician and Libyan crews, outmaneuver the heavier Roman vessels. 93 Roman ships are captured or sunk. It is a humiliation that paralyzes Roman naval ambition for years. But Carthage fails to exploit the opening. The home government, perpetually cautious with funds and wary of empowering its own generals, sends inadequate reinforcements. The war in Sicily becomes a secondary concern for a merchant aristocracy more interested in African land revenues and Iberian silver than in the grinding attrition of mountain warfare. Into this vacuum steps Hannibal Barca. Arriving in Sicily around 247 before the Common Era, he transforms the conflict. Rather than defending static positions, he establishes a fortified base on Mount Herecta, overlooking the coastal plain near Panormus, and launches relentless raids against Roman supply lines, garrisons, and allied towns. His forces, a mixed army of Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, and Campanians, strike fast and withdraw into terrain where legionary formations cannot follow. He moves his base to Mount Eryx, directly above the besieged port of Drepana, and fights a guerrilla campaign that keeps Roman commanders off balance for 6 years. He never loses a pitched engagement. Yet Hamilcar cannot win the war alone. He holds a shrinking perimeter with dwindling supplies, waiting for reinforcements and naval support that Carthage's ruling council dispatches only in trickles. The structural flaw is fatal. Carthage wages war by committee, while Rome wages war by national will. In 242 before the Common Era, Rome makes one final desperate gamble. The state treasury is empty, so wealthy citizens privately finance the construction of 200 new warships, modeled on captured Carthaginian designs and crewed by rigorously trained sailors. This fleet sails for Sicily under the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus. On the 10th of March 241 before the Common Era, the two navies meet near the Aegates Islands, off Sicily's western tip. The Carthaginian fleet, overloaded with grain and supplies destined for Hamilcar's army, is caught in unfavorable winds. Roman ships, lighter and better handled, cut through the Punic formation. 50 Carthaginian vessels are sunk, 70 captured. The supply line to Sicily is severed permanently. Carthage authorizes Hamilcar to negotiate. The Treaty of Lutatius demands complete evacuation of Sicily, return of all Roman prisoners, and an indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver paid over 10 years. Hamilcar, undefeated on land, lays down his arms on orders from a government that lost the war at sea and in political resolve. Sicily, contested for over 2 centuries, passes to Rome, its first overseas province. Carthage retains its African heartland, its commercial networks, its wealth. But something essential has shifted. The Western Mediterranean now has 2 superpowers, and the peace between them carries the weight of unfinished business. The unfinished business begins at home. Within months of the treaty with Rome, the mercenaries who fought Carthage's war in Sicily returned to Africa expecting payment. 20,000 soldiers drawn from Libya, Iberia, Gaul, and the Balearic Islands, men who endured years of siege and skirmish on foreign soil. Carthage, its treasury drained by the indemnity owed to Rome, attempts to renegotiate their wages. The mercenaries refuse. Negotiations collapse. By late 241 before the Common Era, the hired soldiers seize the city of Tunis and raze the Libyan countryside in open revolt. What follows is among the most savage conflicts of the ancient world. The mercenary war, sometimes called the Truculus War, lasts more than 3 years and reduces the Carthaginian hinterland to ruin. Libyan towns that had paid tribute to Carthage for generations join the rebellion, seeing an opportunity to throw off the yoke of foreign taxation. The revolt spreads to Sardinia, where mercenary garrisons murder their Carthaginian officers. Supply lines fracture. Carthage finds itself besieged not by Rome, but by its own former soldiers. Hannibal Barca, the undefeated commander of Sicily, takes the field. His campaign is methodical and merciless. He traps rebel forces in mountain defiles, uses elephants to break their formations, and executes captured leaders with deliberate brutality. The final engagement near the Soar, a narrow pass whose precise location remains debated, annihilates the remaining rebel army. By 238 before the Common Era, the revolt is crushed. But the cost is staggering. Fertile estates burned, irrigation works destroyed, and Sardinia lost permanently when Rome exploits the chaos to annex the island in violation of the existing treaty. Hamilcar draws a conclusion from these disasters. Carthage cannot rely on its African territories alone, nor can it depend on a government divided between commercial oligarchs and cautious senators. He turns west toward Iberia, a land rich in silver, copper, tin, and manpower. In 237 before the Common Era, he crosses to the peninsula with a small army and his young sons, including a boy of 9 named Hannibal. The Barcid conquest of Iberia unfolds over nearly 2 decades. Hamilcar subdues the southern and eastern coastal tribes through a combination of military force, marriage alliances, and the promise of trade. Silver mines in the Sierra Morena and around Castulo pour wealth back to Carthage, replenishing the treasury faster than the indemnity drains it. New settlements rise along the coast, garrisoned by Libyan and Iberian troops loyal to the Barcid family rather than to the distant council in Africa. When Hamilcar dies in battle around 229 before the Common Era, command passes to his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, a diplomat more than a warrior. Hasdrubal founds Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, on a magnificent natural harbour flanked by hills rich in silver ore. The city becomes the Barcid capital in Iberia, a mirror of Carthage itself, with dockyards, warehouses, temples, and a palace complex overlooking the bay. Hasdrubal negotiates the Ebro Treaty with Rome, establishing the river as a boundary of influence, buying time and legitimacy. In 221 before the Common Era, Hasdrubal is assassinated. The army in Iberia, fiercely loyal to the Barcid name, acclaims Hannibal as commander. He is 25 years old, seasoned by years of campaigning alongside his father and brother-in-law, fluent in multiple languages, educated in Greek military theory, and driven by a hatred of Rome that tradition traces to a childhood oath sworn at his father's altar before departing for Iberia. Whether that oath is historical fact or later embellishment, its symbolic power is undeniable. The Barcid project in Iberia has produced not merely a province, but a war machine, funded by silver, manned by Iberian and African veterans, and now commanded by a general whose ambition reaches far beyond the Ebro. Carthage has rebuilt itself not through its senate, but through one family's vision, and that vision points unmistakably toward Italy. That vision materializes in 219 before the Common Era, with the siege of Saguntum. This Iberian city, allied to Rome, but situated well south of the Ebro River, becomes the pretext Hannibal requires. For 8 months his forces batter the walls with rams and siege towers, fighting through streets where defenders hurl burning pitch from rooftops. Saguntum falls in late autumn, its population enslaved, its wealth distributed among Hannibal's troops. Rome sends envoys to Carthage demanding the general's surrender. The Carthaginian Senate refuses. War is declared, and Hannibal has already planned his response, not a defensive campaign in Iberia, but an invasion of Italy itself. In the spring of 218, he departs Carthago Nova with approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. The army crosses the Ebro, fights through hostile Catalan tribes, and reaches the Pyrenees, where Hannibal dismisses thousands of reluctant Iberian soldiers, preferring a smaller force of committed veterans. By midsummer, the column enters southern Gaul, fording the broad Rhone River on rafts, while Gallic warriors mass on the opposite bank. Numidian cavalry cross upstream and strike the Gauls from behind, scattering resistance. The elephants swim the river on submerged platforms, their trunks raised above the current. Then the Alps. No ancient source agrees on the precise route, whether through the Col de Clapier, the Col du Mont-Cenis, or another pass, but all agree on the horror. Early autumn snowfall blankets the high passes. Rock slides sweep men and pack animals into gorges. Mountain tribes roll boulders onto the narrow column from above. The descent proves worse than the ascent, with ice-covered trails forcing engineers to heat rocks with fire and crack them with vinegar to widen the path. After 15 days in the mountains, Hannibal emerges into the Po Valley with roughly 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of surviving elephants. He has lost nearly half his army to cold, starvation, and ambush. Yet what remains is hardened beyond measure. In December of 218, along the freezing banks of the Trebia River, Hannibal lures the Roman consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus into a trap. Roman infantry, wading chest-deep through icy water before dawn, advances into a prepared killing ground. A hidden force under Mago Barca strikes the Roman rear. The legions shatter, losing 2/3 of their strength. Spring brings a second catastrophe for Rome. At Lake Trasimene in June of 217, Hannibal conceals his entire army in the fog-shrouded hills above the lakeshore road. The consul Gaius Flaminius marches his column directly into the ambush. The attack erupts simultaneously along the entire Roman line. 15,000 legionaries die in 3 hours, many drowning in the lake as they flee. Flaminius himself falls in the melee. It is the largest ambush in military history. Rome appoints Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, and he adopts a strategy of shadowing Hannibal without offering battle, denying him a decisive engagement. But Roman pride cannot endure such caution. In 216, the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro assemble the largest army Rome has ever fielded, 86,000 men, and march south to confront Hannibal near the village of Cannae in Apulia. On the 2nd of August, on a flat plain beside the Aufidus River, Hannibal deploys his infantry in a deliberate convex arc, its center bulging toward the Romans. As the massive Roman formation drives forward, the Carthaginian center yields slowly, bending inward, drawing the legions deeper. On both flanks, Numidian and Iberian cavalry rout their Roman counterparts and wheel behind the enemy mass. The Carthaginian wings close like doors. 86,000 Romans find themselves encircled in a space so compressed that men cannot raise their arms to fight. The slaughter continues until evening. Ancient sources record between 50 and 70,000 Roman dead, including the consul Paulus, 80 senators, and scores of military tribunes. It remains among the deadliest single days of combat in recorded history. Hannibal stands supreme in southern Italy, and Rome faces the genuine possibility of annihilation. Yet Rome does not break. In the weeks following Cannae, something extraordinary occurs. A refusal to negotiate, a collective decision to endure whatever cost the war demands. The Senate forbids public mourning beyond 30 days. Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose cautious strategy of avoidance and delay had been mocked before Cannae, now becomes the model for Roman survival. His approach is deceptively simple. Shadow Hannibal's army through the hills and valleys of southern Italy, harass his foragers, cut off stragglers, deny pitched battle at every turn. Rome transforms patience into a weapon. Hannibal holds the south but cannot hold it together. The cities that defect to him, Capua, Tarentum, communities cross Lucania and Bruttium, expect protection he cannot consistently provide. His army, brilliant in the field, lacks siege equipment adequate to threaten Rome's walls. No reinforcements arrive from Carthage in meaningful numbers. The Senate in Carthage, divided between factions supporting the Barcids and those favoring consolidation in Africa, sends resources instead to Iberia and Sicily. Hannibal wages war increasingly alone, sustained by local recruitment and the dwindling loyalty of Italian allies who watch Roman armies methodically recapture their neighbors. The recapture of Capua in 211 before the Common Era signals the turning point in Italy. Rome besieges the city with double lines of fortification, and when Hannibal marches on Rome itself to draw the legions away, the Senate refuses to recall them. Capua falls. Its leading citizens are executed, its population scattered. The message reverberates across every Italian community contemplating alliance with Carthage. Meanwhile, in Iberia, a young commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio arrives in 210 before the Common Era. He is 25 years old, the son and nephew of generals killed fighting the Barcids in Spain. Within a year he captures Carthago Nova in a single audacious assault, seizing the Barcid treasury, their hostages, and their principal harbour. Over the following 4 years, Scipio dismantles Carthaginian power in Iberia battle by battle, defeating Hasdrubal Barca at Becula and driving the remaining Punic forces from the peninsula by 206 before the Common Era. Hasdrubal Barca does not retreat to Africa. Instead, he follows his brother's path, crossing the Alps into Italy in 207 before the Common Era, with fresh troops and elephants, hoping to unite with Hannibal for a decisive combined assault on Rome. The junction never happens. Roman forces intercept his dispatches. At the Metaurus River, 2 consular armies converge on Hasdrubal before Hannibal even knows his brother has crossed into Italy. The battle ends in complete Roman victory. Hasdrubal dies fighting. Roman cavalry carries his severed head south and hurls it into Hannibal's camp. The Carthaginian general, recognizing his brother's features, reportedly understands in that moment that Carthage's fortune in Italy is finished. For 4 more years, Hannibal clings to the mountains of Bruttium, undefeated but strategically irrelevant, while Scipio persuades the Roman Senate to authorize an invasion of North Africa itself. In 204 before the Common Era, Scipio lands near Utica with approximately 25,000 troops. He allies with the Numidian prince Massinissa, whose superb cavalry transforms Roman tactical capability. In the spring of 203, Scipio launches a devastating night attack on the combined camps of Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, and the Numidian king Syphax, burning thousands alive and scattering both armies. A second victory at the Battle of the Great Plains forces Carthage to sue for peace and recall the one commander who might yet save them. After 16 years on Italian soil, Hannibal sails home to defend a city he has not seen since boyhood, carrying with him the remnants of an army that once made Rome tremble. The 2 armies meet on a plain southwest of Zama Regia in the autumn of 202 before the Common Era. Hannibal deploys 80 war elephants in his front line, behind them 3 successive lines of infantry, mercenaries, then Carthaginian levies, then his Italian veterans, the hardened survivors of Cannae and Trasimene. Scipio, having studied Hannibal's methods for years, arranges his maniples in columns rather than the traditional checkerboard, creating lanes through which the elephants can be funneled harmlessly towards the rear. When the charge comes, Roman trumpets and horns blare in unison, panicking many of the beasts, which wheel back into Carthaginian cavalry on the flanks. Those elephants that press forward find themselves channeled through the gaps Scipio designed, neutralized by javelin fire from the sides. The infantry engagement is savage. Hannibal's mercenaries absorb the initial Roman assault, then fall back into the Carthaginian second line, creating momentary confusion. But Scipio's discipline holds. The decisive blow comes from the flanks, where Massinissa's Numidian horsemen and the Roman cavalry, having routed their Carthaginian counterparts, wheel back onto the battlefield and strike Hannibal's veterans from behind. It is Cannae reversed, the master of encirclement encircled. Carthaginian losses reach perhaps 20,000 dead, and as many captured. Hannibal escapes with a small escort, riding east toward Hadrumetum. The peace terms imposed in 201 before the Common Era are designed to cripple. Carthage surrenders its entire war fleet, save 10 triremes. It cedes all territory outside Africa. It agrees to pay an indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years. Most devastating of all, Carthage may not wage war even in Africa without Roman permission, a clause that effectively makes the city a client state subject to Roman arbitration in every border dispute with Numidia. Hannibal remarkably turns to politics. Elected Suffet in 196 before the Common Era, he attacks the entrenched oligarchy that profited from corruption during the war years. He reforms tax collection, restructures state finances, and demonstrates that the indemnity can be paid without crushing the population. His efficiency alarms both Carthaginian aristocrats and Roman senators. Accusations reach Rome that Hannibal conspires with the Seleucid king Antiochus III. Whether true or exaggerated, the political pressure becomes unbearable. In 195 before the Common Era, Hannibal flees Carthage, beginning an exile that carries him to Ephesus, Armenia, Crete, and finally Bithynia, where he takes poison around 183 before the Common Era rather than surrender to Roman agents. Yet Carthage itself recovers with astonishing speed. Stripped of military power, the city pours its energy into commerce and agriculture. The fertile Bagradas Valley produces grain surpluses that Carthage exports across the Mediterranean. Olive oil, fruit, and wine flow from estates organized along principles Mago codified generations earlier. By the mid-2nd century before the Common Era, Carthage has paid its indemnity ahead of schedule and offers to pay the remaining balance in a single installment. Rome refuses. A prosperous Carthage serves Roman interests as a cautious, wealthy trading partner. But prosperity also breeds Roman anxiety. Marcus Porcius Cato, visiting Carthage around 153 before the Common Era on a diplomatic mission, returns to Rome shaken by what he witnesses. Bustling harbors, overflowing granaries, a city radiating wealth and confidence barely 50 years after near annihilation. He begins ending every speech in the Roman Senate, regardless of topic, with the same declaration: Carthage must be destroyed. He brandishes fresh North African figs before his colleagues, emphasizing how close this reviving power sits to Roman shores. The figs are still moist, he insists, proof of dangerous proximity. Numidia's king Massinissa, Rome's loyal ally, steadily encroaches on Carthaginian territory, provoking border conflicts that Carthage cannot resolve without Roman consent. Each appeal to Rome results in judgments favoring Numidia. The trap tightens. Carthage, forbidden to defend itself, watches its hinterland shrink, while Roman hawks circle, waiting for the pretext that will justify what Cato demands: a final reckoning with the city that once sent Hannibal across the Alps. The pretext arrives in 150 before the Common Era. Carthage, driven beyond endurance by Massinissa's relentless seizure of its farmland, finally raises an army without Roman permission and marches against the Numidian king. The campaign ends in disaster. The Carthaginian force is destroyed, but the violation of treaty terms gives Rome exactly what it needs. The Senate declares war. Carthage, desperate to avert catastrophe, offers unconditional surrender. Roman consuls accept the city's weapons: 200,000 sets of arms, 2,000 catapults, leaving the population defenseless. Then comes the final demand: Carthage must be abandoned. The population must relocate 10 miles inland, away from the sea that gave the city its purpose and identity. The demand is refused. Something hardens in the city. Knowing that compliance means cultural annihilation, Carthage chooses resistance. The speed of mobilization astonishes even Roman observers. Temples are converted into weapons factories. Women cut their hair to braid into bowstrings. Citizens forge 300 swords, 500 spears, and 1,000 catapult bolts every day. Doors are stripped from houses for shield timber. Within weeks, a disarmed city transforms itself into a fortress. The first Roman assaults in 149 before the Common Era fail spectacularly. The triple wall system protecting the landward approach, stretching across the isthmus connecting the peninsula to the mainland, proves nearly impregnable. These fortifications rise to 45 feet, backed by stables housing war elephants and barracks for 20,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. Roman commanders underestimate the defenses and suffer humiliating repulses. Disease spreads through the besieging camps. Supply lines stretch thin. For 2 years, the siege stalls. The appointment of Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of the great Africanus, changes everything. Arriving in 147 before the Common Era, he restores discipline to the demoralized Roman forces, seals the harbor mouth with a massive stone mole, and systematically cuts every supply route into the city. Famine tightens its grip through the winter. The commercial harbor falls first, then the military Kothon, its elegant circular basin, once sheltering hundreds of warships, now choked with Roman soldiers. In the spring of 146 before the Common Era, the final assault begins. Roman troops breach the harbor walls and push into the Byrsa quarter. What follows is 6 days of street-by-street combat, unlike anything the ancient Mediterranean has witnessed. Carthaginians fight from rooftops, barricade narrow lanes, hurl stones and burning pitch from upper stories of 6-story residential buildings. Roman soldiers advance by breaking through shared walls, moving house to house, pulling down structures to clear paths for reinforcements. The streets run with blood. Fire consumes entire blocks as Romans torch buildings to deny defenders cover. The destruction is methodical. As each street falls, buildings are demolished, and bodies, living and dead, are swept aside with the rubble. Soldiers work in rotating shifts, maintaining pressure day and night. The population retreats uphill toward the Byrsa citadel, compressing into ever smaller pockets of resistance. When the temple of Eshmun, crowning the hilltop, finally falls, the last defenders, perhaps 50,000 starving survivors, surrender into slavery. Scipio Aemilianus orders the city burned. The fires rage for 17 days. What remains is systematically leveled. Ancient tradition holds that the ground is plowed and sown with salt, though this ritual cursing may be later embellishment. What is certain is the Senate's decree. No one shall rebuild on this site. The territory becomes the Roman province of Africa. 700 years of Carthaginian civilization, its harbors, its temples, its libraries, its streets whitewashed against the Mediterranean sun, collapse into ash and blackened limestone. Scipio, watching the flames, reportedly weeps, contemplating the fate that might one day befall Rome itself. The smoke drifts across the Gulf of Tunis, visible for miles, marking the end of a city that once commanded the Western Sea and sent its ships beyond the known world. For a century, the cursed ground lies largely empty, colonized by scrub grass and wind. Fishermen shelter in the ruins. Goats pick through tumbled masonry, where the Kothon once harbored 200 warships. Yet Rome cannot ignore the strategic value of this promontory forever. In 46 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar, surveying his African territories after the Civil War, decrees the establishment of Colonia Julia Carthago on the very site the Senate had forbidden anyone to rebuild. Roman engineers level the charred Punic foundations on Bursa Hill, carving a new grid of streets oriented to Roman cardinal points. They bury the old city beneath thousands of tons of fill, creating an artificial plateau. The irony is profound. Rome's greatest enemy becomes one of Rome's greatest cities. Within 2 centuries, Roman Carthage grows into the second largest city in the Western Empire, surpassed only by Rome itself. An amphitheater seating 30,000 rises near the shore. The Antonine Baths stretch across acres of waterfront, their vaulted halls rivaling anything in the imperial capital. Aqueducts carry water from Zaghuan, over 80 miles distant, through one of the longest aqueduct systems in the ancient world. Mosaic workshops produce floors of extraordinary refinement, hunting scenes, marine creatures, seasonal allegories, laid in tesserae so fine they rival painting. Yet beneath this Roman surface, Punic culture persists with remarkable tenacity. The language of Carthage does not die with the city. Inscriptions in Neo-Punic script appear across North Africa for centuries after the destruction. Farmers in the hinterland continue speaking Punic dialects well into the Common Era. When Augustine of Hippo writes in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, he notes that Punic remains a living tongue among rural communities in his own diocese. The worship of Tanit evolves but endures, absorbed into the cult of the Roman goddess Caelestis, her crescent symbol persisting on stelae erected generations after the fall. Baal-Hamon merges with Saturn in the African provinces, his sanctuaries receiving offerings according to rituals unchanged in essence for half a millennium. Mago's 28 volumes on agriculture, translated into Latin by order of the Roman Senate even as Carthage burned, become foundational texts for Roman farming. Columella and Pliny cite the Carthaginian master repeatedly. The techniques of grafting, irrigation, and estate management that feed the Roman Empire carry Punic knowledge forward through centuries that forget the name of their original author. Christianity transforms Carthage once more. Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine make the city one of the intellectual capitals of early Christian thought. Augustine's writings, shaped in a city built on Punic ashes, influence Western theology for over 1,000 years. The Vandal conquest in 439, the Byzantine reconquest a century later, and the Arab founding of Tunis gradually reduce ancient Carthage to a quarry. Its columns travel to cathedrals in Pisa and Genoa. Its stones build mosques and palaces. By the medieval period, the site is farmland and scattered villages. Archaeological rediscovery begins in earnest in the 19th century. French excavations uncover the Tophet, igniting debates about child sacrifice that continue among scholars today. The urns contain the cremated remains of infants, but whether these represent sacrifice or the burial of children who died naturally remains fiercely contested. International campaigns in the 1970s coordinate dozens of nations to excavate before modern development erases the remaining layers. Today the ruins occupy a quiet suburb of Tunis. Fragments of the Antonine Baths catch the afternoon light. The ancient harbors survive as shallow lagoons, their outlines still traceable from the air. On Bursa Hill, A museum holds Punic stelae carved with the sign of Tanit, a triangle topped by a circle, arms raised in perpetual supplication. Terracotta masks stare from glass cases with expressions both serene and unsettling. Amphorae that once carried wine and garum across the sea rest in climate-controlled silence. The lesson Carthage leaves is not simple. A civilization of extraordinary commercial genius, navigational daring, and agricultural innovation could not survive the political fragmentation that prevented unified response to existential threat. Its memory endures not in monuments, but in the knowledge it transmitted, the routes it charted, and the enduring question of what the Western Mediterranean might have become had the balance tilted differently on a single autumn afternoon near Zama. The golden light settles over Barca Hill, as it has for 3,000 years, indifferent to the empires that have claimed and lost this shore. Thank you for joining this journey through the complete history of Carthage. If these stories have brought the ancient world closer, consider subscribing so you never miss the next civilization we bring to life.